Welcome, welcome everyone to the Walker Lecture Series. For 124 years, thanks to the generosity of the Timothy and Abigail Walker family, the series has brought entertainment and information to Concord, specifically free lectures on history, literature, art, and science, and free dramatic, musical, and other cultural events. My name is John Kelly. I am one of the trustees, and I am pleased to serve with the other trustees, Paula Demers, Joanne Martin, Alwyn Fine, and our president, Dale Harrington. Some people will be watching this pre-recorded, but for those of us who are here live in the moment, I will say next week, 1 week from tonight, which is March 24th, we will have a special double feature travelogue, The World of the Bear and Autumn in Denali, with a personalized Walker Lecture introduction from the videographer, Tom Sterling. That will be available on TV, pre-recorded, and does not require a Zoom link. It will be available after the 24th using the YouTube link from Concord TV. But tonight, art. Jane Oneail is an independent scholar with a master's in art history from Boston University and a master's in art in education from Harvard University. Jane is a New Hampshire native, and she has worked at the League of New Hampshire Craftsmen, where she served as executive director, and the Currier Museum of Art, where she was senior educator. I get the feeling that some people in our audience already know some of those things, and that's wonderful. I'm glad that her colleagues are here, and we welcome you all. To tell us about Frank Lloyd Wright and Norman Rockwell, please welcome Jane Oneail.
Thank you so much, John. Let me just pull up my PowerPoint. And I want to thank everybody for joining us tonight. I am delighted that you're curious about this material, and I'm especially honored that so many good friends have tuned in tonight to go through this material with us together, and new friends too. So our subject tonight is American Icons, Frank Lloyd Wright and Norman Rockwell. If you enjoy tonight's presentation, I should say, please check out my website, which is Culturally Curious, or iamculturallycurious.com, because I give presentations like this on a regular basis, and you can check out my calendar for other free virtual programs. So I was really excited to be invited to present tonight. And when John Kelly and I originally first spoke, we talked about doing 2 separate programs with an intermission in the middle. But I think to sort of accommodate attention spans in the era of Zoom, we've sort of narrowed it down to just about an hour together. But we had already talked about doing Frank Lloyd Wright and Norman Rockwell. So instead of doing 2 separate programs on these 2 American icons, I've tried to condense it down to about 1 hour and do justice to both of these individuals. So I have just the shortest preamble, and then we will dive right into this material. I feel like I have strong connections to both of these creators. For Frank Lloyd Wright, as the Zimmerman House docents in the audience tonight know, I grew up across town from a Frank Lloyd Wright house. I interned at the Zimmerman House when I was in college, and then I had the distinct pleasure of running the tour program there, where the docents were so dedicated, they inspired me to travel around the country and get a taste of Frank Lloyd Wright everywhere. So I've probably been to close to about 40 different Frank Lloyd Wright homes over the years. And for Norman Rockwell, as the museum docents who are with us tonight know so well, I have always really loved his work because, according to the best research about learning in and through the arts, it's ideal to start off with images that are realistic and that tell stories. These are really accessible images to people who are new to looking at art, and they're also really fun for anybody with any degree of experience experience. So I've always loved using a Norman Rockwell image as a warm-up image. And so over the years, I've spent a lot of time looking at his images and researching them. So Wright and Rockwell were not exactly contemporaries, but they both produced work that was distinctly American and that in many ways reflect our country's values and their our aspirations. So let's dive in and take a look at how we'll sort of compare them and how we'll examine them tonight. So here we have two magazine covers featuring our architect and our artist. Wright is on the cover of Time magazine from 1938. And you can see just over his shoulder here is a drawing of his famous home, Falling Water, just behind him. And then we have the cover of the Saturday Evening Post from 1960, where the text is already declaring he's America's most loved artist. And the image here is Rockwell's famous triple self-portrait, where he shows himself painting himself, but also looking in the mirror, looking kind of goofy, and then translating that into sort of a debonair portrayal of himself. So the covers really reflect not just an interest in the work that both of these men were doing, but also in who they were as individuals. And of course, we don't have all the time in the world to get into all of this, but they're sort of a study of opposites. There's a lot of differences when it comes to Frank Lloyd Wright and Norman Rockwell. Wright, who we see on the left here, had a confidence bordering on arrogance, shall we say. You know, even here in the picture, he's got the scarf and the beret and the walking stick. He once said something, I feel coming on a strange disease, humility. So, I mean, he approached his work with this sort of sense of grandeur, sort of imbued in it, of himself and of the work he was doing. But Rockwell, on the other hand, had sort of a self-deprecating humor. There was some humility there as well. We're looking at his painting from 1948 called The Gossips. And so we see sort of news traveling through town from top to bottom, left to right, and we can see how everybody's responding to this gossip. Now, Rockwell had this image. He had formulated this image in his mind 20 years before he painted it. He just didn't know what the punchline would be at the end. And then he came up with it, Eureka. He's like, I am going to be the subject of the gossip. So he paints himself in at the very end, and then finally confronting the source of the gossip over here. So he was known to be a very sort of fun, friendly person. People who posed for him said it was more fun than going to the movies. He kept you in stitches with funny stories. So a lot of difference between their personalities. More differences here. Frank Lloyd Wright's life was sort of marked by scandal and by tragedy. I mean, we have affairs, we have murders, we have fires. So there was a lot that was happening in his life that sort of kept him in the news and sort of kept him the subject of popular interest for sure. And then on the right, we have Norman Rockwell painting his famous image of downtown Stockbridge, Massachusetts at Christmas time. And so we have this notion that Norman Rockwell led a quiet life, one that's really associated with small town life. He lived out the last 25 years or so of his life in Stockbridge. Another major difference between these two creators is that Frank Lloyd Wright's work is strikingly modern. It still is today. We look at something like the Guggenheim from 1959, and it still looks futuristic to us. It looks like it was created in the future. Who would conceive of an art museum that doesn't have squared off walls? It's a spiral, and it's still revolutionary when you look at it. And then you think of Norman Rockwell and his view of the world. The way he created images was to create decidedly nostalgic images that idealized American life, that celebrated sort of a conservative view of American life. This is his painting called The Runaway from 1958, where we see the little boy who has wandered into a diner and is having a conversation with a friendly police officer here, and the man behind the counter. Fun, quick story. I showed this image to a group of lawyers not too long ago, and one of them came up to me at the end and said, I was a judge for 30 years and I had this image this painting, a copy of it, in my chambers, and I never looked that closely at it, and I always thought it was an image of a cop and a little boy at court. And I said, well, it always pays off to look a little bit more closely. So in terms of similarities, another big similarity, well, a big similarity between Wright and Rockwell is that they both had really long, prolific careers. We see Wright over here on the left, sitting with some architectural students, and he worked for about 70 years and designed more than 1,000 structures. And so, and he was really sort of creative and innovative throughout that long career. Rockwell is credited with creating more than 4,000 images. He had a 64-year career with the Boy Scouts of America, a 47-year career with the Saturday Evening Post, and he created about 320 magazine covers for them, including this image that we see here that's called Deadline from 1938, where you sort of get the sense it's a self-portrait and he's struggling to come up with some material. Another sort of similarity or connection between these two creators is the fact that their creative work extended beyond the boundaries of the medium that they are best known for. So we think of Frank Lloyd Wright primarily as an architect, but he was doing so much more. He was designing furniture, he was designing lighting, even as we see here in his Oak Park residence from right around 1895. He's created this high back furniture that sort of helps to create a room within the room in this dining room, and then this really sort of elegant diffused lighting. Now, it might not be furniture that you want to sit in necessarily, but it sort of draws you in. Frank Lloyd Wright even designed clothing for people to wear within the spaces that he designed. And then we have Norman Rockwell on the right here, and we see him with the camera. And a really interesting facet of his work is that he would take anywhere from 50 to 100 photographs of his models and then paint from the photographs. So, so you can almost think of him as like a movie director in some ways. He knew exactly what he wanted in terms of poses, and he would coach his models to get exactly what he needed. So sometimes it was, you know, the arch of an eyebrow, the lifting of a toe, but he would create this kind of sequence of photographs to achieve and capture those perfect poses. All right, so one last major similarity between Wright and Rockwell is that, and this will be sort of the linchpin for tonight's program, is that each of these creators had a breakthrough in response to a major change in American culture. For Frank Lloyd Wright, he was known as a rich man's architect, and we'll see that he has this breakthrough in his career to build middle-class residents. And we see here the Jacobs House from, which is in Madison, Wisconsin, and dates to the mid-1930s. So we'll be delving into this house type that he develops, and we'll look very closely at the Zimmerman House in Manchester, which I know many of you are familiar with. For Norman Rockwell, what is the change in his career? Well, he pivots away from sort of the subject matter, the topics that he's most familiar with and most celebrated for, and he begins to respond to the major cultural shifts of the 1960s. And he begins to create works that are responding to the civil rights movement, the rise in feminism, like we see here in this work from the 1960s, where we see sort of a traditional notion of femininity with the mother and daughter with curlers in their hair looking at, you know, a fancy portrait by John Singer Sargent, and then sort of a more modern woman with her hair undone, wearing blue jeans, carrying a leather jacket, and an artist portfolio, checking out the work of Pablo Picasso. So we have the notion of Norman Rockwell really sort of doing a 180 in terms of his subject matter to respond to a changing world. Okay, so that's sort of our starting point for tonight, and we'll move quickly through this. So it's the notion of these two creative men really coming up with a brilliant idea and a brilliant response to changes and needs in American culture. So let's get started with Frank Lloyd Wright. And we're going to get started with the structure that he is sort of best associated with, most associated with, and of course, one of my favorite structures in the entire world, and that is Falling Water. And this is in southwestern Pennsylvania. This was a home designed for a man who owned a department store, and his family had a little cabin that was a retreat for them out there. And they got in touch with Frank Lloyd Wright to build them a more significant structure, ideally one where they could lunch and picnic near the waterfall and take in this beautiful sight. And Wright sat on this commission for about 9 months. And then one day his client said he was going to drive to his studio and see how the work was going. And supposedly Frank Lloyd Wright just shook the design out of his sleeve in the space of a few hours, with all of his students surrounding him, just absolutely mesmerized. And of course, this is one of the most celebrated structures in American life. It's won countless awards. It's been recognized as one of the most important buildings, not just of the 20th century, but of essentially all of American history. So I wanted to sort of move inside and give you a sense in terms of how Frank Lloyd Wright would design for a wealthy client, because I think this will help us to appreciate and it will help to inform what he was doing when it comes to building middle-class homes. Is there any space that's more elegant and more inviting than the fireplace at Falling Water? So what we're looking at is a hearth that looks like it's the natural stone sort of coming up out of the ground seemingly, and creating this sort of seemingly natural setting that has these kind of modern touches to it. I love that there's a little bar on a tree trunk right next to it, but then there's all this red metal that's sort of kind of circulating through the building. And then there's this element here that I've always loved, this spherical cauldron, which is on a hinge and can swing into the fireplace. You can actually cook stews over this fireplace. So there's this blending of natural elements and modern elements here. And I think it comes together so beautifully in the fireplace, which Frank Lloyd Wright always really considered to be the heart of the home, really important central core element. Now, as you're standing here, if you were to turn to the left, this is the site that you would see. All of this really low furniture, these natural sort of autumnal colors, a lot of furs and animal skins kind of draped over here. But the focus is really all of this light, all of these large windows, which with better lighting in this photograph, I mean, we'd be able to see all of nature that's surrounding this space here. Now, the one last element that I wanted to share with you from Falling Water, which is just the knockout for me, is through these doors over here. So imagine we're just walking across this space. We go through these doors and there is essentially a glass box there. And what makes this glass box so incredible is that it opens up and the top of it sort of recedes back. And while you're standing inside the house, you have direct access to the flowing water underneath. There's a staircase there. So you can walk down these steps and, dip your toes in the water while you're having your coffee in the morning. You can just open up that glass box and just listen to the water throughout the day. Frank Lloyd Wright designed a space with seemingly understanding the experience of all of your senses as you're in this space, and designs this kind of unique experience to connect with the natural world in this really kind of heroic structure. It's just outstanding in so many ways. So let's take a turn and imagine and look a little bit more closely, I should say, at how he moves from designing a house like that to designing a house for the American middle class. Now, Frank Lloyd Wright had a number of different house types throughout his career. You have the prairie style up on top here. You have the textile block style that he pioneered in the 1920s, almost exclusively on the West Coast. And then you have what is called, or what he called, the Usonian house that we see down here on the lower right. And this is the Jacobs house again. Frank Lloyd Wright said, a modest house, this Usonian house, a dwelling that has no feeling for the grand, except as the house extends itself to the flat parallel of the ground. So a modest house indeed. This was really something that was designed in response to the Great Depression, to Wright knowing that he no longer had a back pocket full of really wealthy clients who would be able to spend any amount of money on the design for a big palatial structure. So Wright sort of compressed all these great ideas that you see at Falling Water, and he put them into the Usonian house. And for me, well, for Frank Lloyd Wright, Usonian was a synonym for American, but I think it has all of these other sort of connections and connotations in our brain. Usonian sounds utopian, it sounds utilitarian, it sounds unifying. And so all of these concepts are sort of in there as well. Now, the first Usonian house that we see here was about 1,500 square feet, so about the size of a regular condo, and it cost $5,000 at the time, which is roughly in today's money about $90,000. Between 1936 and 1959, Frank Lloyd Wright designed 310 of these Usonian houses. A total of about 140 of them were built. Frank Lloyd Wright was never on site for the construction, but his clients loved them. After 35 years, 50% of his clients were still in these Usonian houses that he built for them. And at first glance, of course, this couldn't be further away from Falling Water. This is a really sort of simple, low structure, and there isn't the grandeur of that setting. Of course, you can't even really see how you would enter a structure like this. But as we move to the backyard, this is the front view. As we move to the backyard, we can see that it's all glass and it all opens up into a very private garden, private backyard. And so there's this wonderful connection with nature, this sort of emphasis on nature, this embrace of nature that that goes along with Usonian design and sort of serves as that nice connection back to the great work that Frank Lloyd Wright did for more wealthy clients. When you go inside a Usonian house, and this is still that Jacobs house there that we've been looking at, you can see that sort of like Falling Water, the furniture is really low, but as we see when we get to the Zimmerman house, everything is designed according to a grid to create this sense of harmony of proportions, a really sort of totally unified design. But you can, but Frank Lloyd Wright was designing all of these interiors, and for the most part, even the furniture. So, so for short money, you could get a design, a really well-designed house as a middle-class American. Now, that is almost entirely true as we get to the Zimmerman House in Manchester, New Hampshire. So the Zimmerman House was designed after World War II, and the Usonian houses that Frank Lloyd Wright designed after World War II are all a little bit nicer. You have clients that have a little bit more wealth and they're buying slightly larger pieces of property. So there's a few more bells and whistles when it comes to these post-war Usonian houses. And that is certainly the case when it comes to Dr. Isidore and Lucille Zimmerman. He had a medical practice. She was his nurse, and they owned a 13-room colonial in downtown Manchester. And they just had the sense that this very large house was not working for them as a professional couple without children in their 40s. So they wrote directly to Frank Lloyd Wright after reading a book about his concepts without even really being familiar with the visuals associated with his design. They met and they sort of fell in love in terms of client and architect, and they proceeded with the building of their home on the other side of town, on the north end of Manchester. So here we can see the building in process, and Frank Lloyd Wright sent along a young man named John Geiger, who was one of his apprentices who sort of oversaw the whole operation and kept Frank Lloyd Wright sort of abreast with the problems or any issues that were happening. So the result was this house, and this is a historic photo. I love it because we have all the birch trees there that are no longer there. We've got the classic car, and you can even, if you've got very good eyes, see the dog at the front door. So the result is a home that's about 1,800 square feet. It's 2 beds, 2 bathrooms, and Frank Lloyd Wright designed everything from the furnishings inside to the landscape to even the mailbox. The original quote was for $36,000. It ended up being closer to $60,000, and in today's money, that would be close to about $500,000. So what did they get for that money? They got a house that has no attic, no basement, and no garage. They're sort of signing on for a certain way of living, and it was a minimalist lifestyle for sure. So so let's kind of zoom in and see how there are these elements of the best elements of falling water kind of associated here. We look at the landscape from above here, and we can see that Frank Lloyd Wright sited this home diagonally on this plot. And so we'll see that there's a really private backyard, and he's also taking advantage of passive solar heat in this case as well. When you approach the house, when you turn into this driveway here, you see all of the building elements. They're right there, and they're apparent. You have the Georgian cypress, you have the concrete blocks, you have the brick, and of course you have the tile roof here. Now, one of my favorite things about this house, and you'll probably never hear anyone gush so much about a carport ever, but it is the carport. And it's this open structure with this long kind of panoramic view when you first drive up. And the view is of this beautiful backyard, this quiet green space that is phenomenal to see any time of the year. If it's snowing or if it's raining, this is such a peaceful spot. And now think of what you see when you first drive home, when you park your car. Are you looking at the inside of a crowded garage? Are you looking, at your neighbor's house? This is the most peaceful way to come home and to just sort of bring the blood pressure down. It's absolutely exquisite. So then, and I should mention that our little tour of the Zimmerman House here will certainly be abbreviated just due to our time tonight. But what we're looking at here is an inverted plan of the house, just so that we can sort of stay adjusted to that first view of the exterior. So we pulled into the carport here, and then we'll just walk across this patio and head inside the home and to the garden room or the living room. So here we are inside the main living space of the Zimmerman House. And what I want to emphasize to you here, again, it's those autumnal colors, these connections back to nature that we saw at Falling Water. And everything here is sort of modular too. It's wonderful in its utilitarianism. So these little ottomans, these hassocks can function as a place to rest your feet. They can function as seating, and there's an abundant amount of seating. This bench here is almost 30 feet long. Imagine having a 30-foot long couch in your house. You can have a lot of people over for that. Now, the proportions of that couch might seem a little bit off of this bench seating, and these those back cushions are roughly 4 feet by 4 feet in terms of their dimensions. And there is that same grid, which is a little bit hard to see in this photograph, that exists scored into the concrete floor here as well. And that 4 foot by 4 foot grid organizes so much of this house. The next image I'm going to show you, we're going to sort of come into this space and look out through these windows here. And you can see there's a wooden window that almost seems to float in the middle of these two large brick piers. And not surprisingly, that window that seems to float is about 4 feet by 4 feet. So it kind of echoes those cushions from just across the way. And you'll see they kind of function like picture frames, but they're framing the view of the backyard in this case. What a brilliant thing to do. What a fantastic way to connect to nature. And just below them, there is a little window box inside. So there's greenery inside, and then there's glass that connects directly to the brick here. And it almost creates this seamless transition from the window box inside to a window box outside. So he's blending the whole sense of inside and outside. You'll also notice that there's this really sort of subtle light coming through these louvers here, so that you almost get the sense of light filtering down through the leaves of trees, and that these brick piers here function like trees. He is creating with this small, seemingly modest house, the sense of being in a forest, that quiet peacefulness that you feel when you are out in nature. It's really a brilliant design in so many ways. This is just a closer look at the light coming through those louvers there, and then also how the glass connects directly to the wood here. So seemingly blending that transition from interior to exterior. As we look back where we came from in the garden room, you can see the Zimmerman house also has a nice big fireplace like we saw at Falling Water, and it's open, and sometimes the Zimmermans would even cook over it. I always love that there is a lintel here, but it is unsupported. There's no post there. It's an architect showing off for other architects even. He even breaks that lintel as just sort of like a tour de force in some ways. So just a few other spaces in terms of walking you through the Zimmerman house, getting a sense, an appreciation for this middle-class design. With all of the bells and whistles and the great aspects of Falling Water being kind of filtered into the way this house is formed. What we're looking at now are two views of not the dining room, but the dining loggia. Frank Lloyd Wright designed a dining space for two, and it's essentially a hallway with one side that is all glass and opens up. All of these doors open up so that, 3/4 of the year, you could be essentially dining outside. And he does this. There's so many principles from this dining room that I've always just loved, that have stayed with me. But here we also see a vertical grid system that's in place, in addition to that 4 foot by 4 foot grid that's scored into the floor. The vertical grid system is about 5 courses of brick and mortar. It's about 13 inches. So, and that determines the height of nearly everything in the house. So it determines the height of the hassocks. Double that, it's the height of the tables, and it determines the width of all of these shelves throughout. So that makes everything really easy to switch around and change. You can just easily pick up your dining room table and bring it over to that 30-foot bench in the garden room and accommodate more and more people for dining. So so smart in so many ways. We're going to skip some of the key places. You'll have to go on the tour itself or come to another one of my programs. But I did want to show you the master bedroom. And I remember when I gave tours of the Zimmerman house, people would always look so disappointed when they came into this room, because when you hear master bedroom these days, we're also accustomed to HGTV. We're expecting something grand. And this is a really sort of small, intimate space. We've got a lot of floor space that's been cleared because the bookshelves here are up in the air. They've been levitated, and everything in this space is supposed to draw your eye upwards and look at the beautiful woodwork on the ceiling. Again, it's this board and batten construction that is roughly 13 inches in terms of its width. And that wooden construction sort of seamlessly blends inside and outside. Here we have the pane of glass separating them, and we see it over here too. Imagine lying in your bed and looking up at that ceiling. So there's all these wonderful ways that Frank Lloyd Wright, even without setting foot on this property, knows to design in such a way that that you have sort of the maximum experience of that exterior. And here is the view of the house from the back. We saw it had that very private front facade, and from the rear, it's all glass, and in the twilight, all lit up like that. It is just such a spectacular sight. So in the end, you have this really sort of incredible refuge in the middle of a city. You have this private, quiet, almost camp-like space where you can connect to nature. And if you joined us earlier, you probably heard some of my old colleagues from the Currier House and the Zimmerman House talking about the Khalil House, which the Currier recently acquired. And this is another Frank Lloyd Wright designed Usonian house, just about three houses away from the Zimmerman House. And you can see it's a completely different approach to Usonian design. This is called the Usonian automatic, and the automatic part means you build it yourself. So it's these concrete blocks, and it's just so exciting that the Currier now owns 2 Wright designed homes on one street. And I'm sure once it's safe to do so, not only all of us will be visiting, but I think a lot of people from all over the country and the world. So to kind of summarize on Wright, certainly he's had such an impact on American life, American culture, because of his incredible designs, and because of his sort of larger than life personality. And I think we don't talk enough about how his Usonian designs have impacted kind of modestly scaled homes today. But if you're interested in him and his legacy, there are a number of public Frank Lloyd Wright designed buildings, I believe 72, and at this point you can probably do virtual tours of at least a third of them, 3D tours. If you're interested in buying a Frank Lloyd Wright house, the last time I checked, there was one as cheap as $200,000, but I'm sure it would cost a lot to keep it up. And of course, all of the historical and fictional books that have come out recently, Devil in the White City, Loving Frank, have sort of kept an interest in Frank Lloyd Wright alive. But I think for me, particularly someone who still lives in Manchester in a modest ranch style home with a carport, I have to say the impact that his design work had when it comes to Usonian designs is something that's really long lasting, and something that's really just sort of outstanding, considering what the rest of his body of work looked like. So let's take a turn now, and we're going to move from Frank Lloyd Wright to Norman Rockwell, and think about how Norman Rockwell really sort of changed what he was doing. Interestingly, right around the same age that Frank Lloyd Wright did. Frank Lloyd Wright started designing Usonian homes when he was about 70 years old, and we'll see that Norman Rockwell begins, he strikes out on a dramatic change in his career at about the same age. So we are looking at one of his most famous images, the Freedom from Want, part of his 4 Freedoms series from 1943, inspired by Franklin Delano Roosevelt's State of the Union speech from 2 years earlier. And of course, most Americans think of this as like the classic scene of a Thanksgiving meal with multiple generations of a family gathering around a middle-class table, and this giant bird at the center of the picture isn't even the focus. The freedom from want means that nobody there is hungry. They're just there to enjoy each other's company, and the bird is just the cherry on top, essentially. Now, what is Norman Rockwell's genius here is this figure at the bottom right, who is looking out at us and essentially extending this table to us. Frank Lloyd Wright, Norman Rockwell had this incredible ability to make us all feel like we were a part of the middle-class American dream. And I have another image here to kind of underscore that notion. He could create characters, or create a story with his works that include characters that almost every one of us could identify with in some way. This one is called Going and Coming. It's from 1947. And so we see the middle-class nuclear family that's heading off to the beach for the day with mom, dad, at least 4 kids here, the dog, and grandma. And of course, when they're going, they're filled with energy, filled with excitement, and expectation. And then in the end, as they come home at twilight, you know, dad's cigar is this tiny little stump. Mom has fallen asleep. Even the little girl's bubble from up here is just ready to burst. And then Norman Rockwell always gives us a little bit of humor. Grandma hasn't changed from going to coming to going. She's still the same. So of course, there's somebody here for all of us to connect with, whether or not you personally identify with someone. Maybe you think that's exactly like my dad, or that's exactly like my grandmother. There's this sense of coming together around his images. And on the opposite note, Norman Rockwell could also create images that in the same way depicted a sense of loneliness and isolation that I think almost everyone can immediately identify with. This is an image that he created in 1962 for the cover of McCall's magazine. And we're just looking at a child who's sitting at the top of the staircase looking down at her parents' Christmas party. And in this moment, as we look at this picture, we are all that child. We all know exactly how it feels to be that little kid who's sort of longing to be a part of something, ready for the next phase of their life. And Norman Rockwell is even using colors here to emphasize this sense of isolation here. It's all these really sort of rich, warm tones in the party down below. And the little girl's white pajamas are rendered with this kind of white gray that shows just how isolated she is in this moment. It's really poignant. Now, with these images that kind of encapsulate American life, he's always credited for, you know, defining and reflecting American life. Now, what's missing here is, of course, anyone who isn't white. And Norman Rockwell once said that his editor, George Horace Lorimer, the Saturday Evening Post editor, who was a very liberal man, told him never to show colored people except as servants. So there was a very strict policy that he was abiding by with his images for the Saturday Evening Post. And so as he was creating and defining what American life looked like, he was editing out essentially who was a part of America. But for Norman Rockwell, he bristled at this policy, and he was always kind of finding a way to get around it. And so he would create incredible images like this. This is from 1945. It's called Homecoming. It's this phenomenal scene of a young GI who's come home after World War II, and the entire neighborhood is so enthusiastic, so excited to see him. His whole family is pouring out the door over here. His mother's arms are open wide. Once again, we're seeing our protagonist from the back. We are all this GI in this moment, seeing the neighborhood excited to see him. And interestingly, Norman Rockwell had gone to a neighborhood in Troy, New York, and took photographs and really got a sense of this particular kind of tenement neighborhood that he was going to use as inspiration for this cover. And while he was there, he saw Black and white children playing together. And it was really important to him to tell that story on the cover of this particular issue of the Saturday Evening Post. And so he was sure to show that Black children and white children were playing together in this integrated neighborhood. And this was something that he was able to sort of sneak by the editors for the Saturday Evening Post. Now, like I said, he had a 47-year career with this publication and did over 300 covers for them. And then by the 1960s, he was ready to leave. He said, for 47 years, I portrayed the best of all possible worlds, grandfathers, puppy dogs, things like that. That kind of stuff is dead now, and I think it's about time. Norman Rockwell actually talked with his therapist about really wanting to do something that was important, create work that was really important. So after he leaves the Saturday Evening Post, he sends $500 to the NAACP and becomes a lifetime member. And then he decides to take on the subject of Ruby Bridges, the young girl in New Orleans, the 6-year-old girl in New Orleans, who was integrating a white school. And so this picture that he created called The Problem We All Live With from 1964 is just such an incredible and powerful image. And many of us are probably familiar with the actual photographs of Ruby Bridges, who was escorted into school by U.S. Marshals for her safety, because throughout her entire year as at this school, she was greeted each day by protesters who were protesting her right to get an education at this school. And the protests were as ugly as you might imagine. I mean, they actually put dolls in coffins and sort of paraded it around. So in addition to this, the Ruby Bridges family's lives really changed. Her father lost his job. Her mother, they no longer sold food to her mother at the grocery store, and her grandparents, who were sharecroppers, lost their land. So this family lost everything so that this little brave girl could go to school. Now, Norman Rockwell painted this picture for Look magazine, and it was not on the cover, it was inside, and it got a real reaction from the readers of Look magazine. But I wanted to share with you this one letter, which kind of shows the best things that can happen when people are sort of open to having their minds changed. We have, "Dear Mr. Rockwell, I've never written to a national figure before, nor do I intend to make a habit of it now. Allow me to say that I have never been so deeply moved by any picture as by your painting in the current issue of Look magazine. Thank you for showing this white Southerner how ridiculous he looks. The truth is pretty hard to take until we get it from a Norman Rockwell." So let's look at his picture and how it became so powerful. So he had actually multiple models for Ruby Bridges, and we can see here some of the photographs here and how he went about posing these little girls. I always loved the boards that he would put under their feet so that he could accomplish the look of walking. And he kind of combines all of these little girls into one figure. He knew that this picture would be on the inside of the magazine and that there would be a gutter down the center of the picture. So this sketch over here on the left shows that he was sort of playing with, should Ruby be at the front of this group? Should she be lingering at the back? And we see that he obviously decides that she should be kind of moving with purpose and with intention here, not hovering in the back. And the result, of course, is that we see all of this danger around her, this implied danger, or this very explicit danger in some cases. We've got the racial epithet, we've got KKK on the wall, and most notably, we have that splattered red tomato there. And that red is supposed to call up in our minds blood and danger. And because Ruby Bridges has just moved past it in this picture, we don't know, did it just miss her? Was it just thrown? Is she still like marching forward with this sense of dignity and purpose, having just literally been almost assaulted? So there's a lot going on in this picture that is really sort of brilliantly contrived in order to kind of point to the bravery that was involved in this particular situation. Interestingly, on the 50th anniversary of the integration of Southern schools, this painting went and stayed at the White House just outside of the Oval Office for some time. And so this is America's first Black president, Barack Obama, looking at this picture by Norman Rockwell. And in this photograph, he's discussing this picture with Ruby Bridges. And you can go online, you can go on YouTube and watch the video of their conversation. But there's this incredible moment where he turns to her and says, "I wouldn't be here doing what I'm doing now if you weren't there doing what you did." It always brings a tear to my eye. And I would argue that Norman Rockwell was using the same skills that we see over here with his picture from McCall's to underscore Ruby Bridges' isolation and also her bravery. So he's using the way he isolates this figure, the warm colors around the cool colors. He's doing the same thing over here, and he's using the innocence of a young child for all of us to project ourselves onto her. We remember what it's like to be young and innocent, or we look at our own kids or grandkids, and we project our feelings onto them and back over to Ruby Bridges. So he is using painting in such a compelling way here to really share a strong and pointed message about his beliefs about the civil rights movement in particular. So he continued on in the 1960s to work with Look magazine and a few other publications, but especially Look magazine, to create images about the civil rights movement. And this, of course, would not have been of interest to the Saturday Evening Post at this time. So the next image that he created was called Southern Justice or Murder in Mississippi. This is from 1965. And this is about the story of a group of civil rights workers in Mississippi who were murdered by a mob that was led by the local sheriff. So you can see on the right, the early sketch, Norman Rockwell has shown these workers kind of staring down the mob here. And then a later sketch, a monochromatic sketch essentially, that his editors decided was suitable for publication. He's cropped out the mob. He's only left their shadows here, their looming shadows. And he's shown someone who's already sort of down on the ground, somebody who's already been assaulted or shot, and then somebody who's kind of staring down the mob here. It's heart-wrenching. And just to show you how involved and dedicated to this process Norman Rockwell was, we can see his models here in his studio. And you can see him sort of creating that special effect of the lighting. And then Norman Rockwell even got special dispensation for human blood. And here he is wearing the white shirt and smearing that human blood on his sleeve so he could paint it accurately for this picture and tell the story of these slain civil rights workers. Now he does other pictures for Look magazine, but we're going to skip ahead to 1967 and go to his sort of famous picture called The New Kids on the Block, or The New Kids in the Neighborhood. And this is, again, a sort of a brilliant picture that kind of shows the tensions around integration in America. And so he has very carefully created this composition, and I think really purposely looked at or imagined the poses of each of these individuals and how we would read them and how we would understand their feelings about who they're seeing and how they're confronting this new situation. So of course, in this picture, we have the Black family that is moving into what is presumably a white neighborhood. The moving truck is in the background, their living room is still on their front lawn, and the kids are standing out in front of the house. And Rockwell has even included, cats and dogs here. So our initial impression is that there's going to be tension, that there could be fighting like cats and dogs. We're reading the body language, who's leaning in, who's leaning back. There's a sense of curiosity, there's a sense of reserve, but he gives us the biggest clue here that everything is going to be just fine. And that's with those baseball gloves. He's got one, and oh look, he's even on a baseball team. So we know that in just a minute or two, this vast expanse of green lawn over here is going to be their playing field, and everything's going to be just fine. But essentially, he is showing us the moment where people are confronting someone who is different from them on both sides. And this is what was happening in America then. It's still happening today. And this is like this really optimistic reminder that there is more that unites us than separates us. So here's just a quick look at how he worked with his models in this case. He's even modeling the dog here to get the perfect pose. And then I just want to connect this back to that scene of going and coming that we saw before. This picture where we're all supposed to kind of identify with someone, or at least with the bigger picture, with this sense of being a part of the American middle class, of, you know, going to the beach for the day with our family. That's essentially what he's trying to tap into with a picture like we see with the New Kids on the Block. We're all supposed to tap into this idea of, oh yeah, I met someone who looks completely different from me. And it was, you know, it was strange and awkward at first, but then we realized that we have a lot in common. It's a very hopeful picture that way. And take a look at Norman Rockwell with this image. I love it. He looks so defiant. I think he was getting radical in his old age, because one of the last pictures that he created for Look magazine, it was called The Right to Know from 1968. And it accompanied a major article that was about government transparency in terms of the Vietnam War. It talked about racial inequality. It talked about all of these really pressing issues. And so Norman Rockwell has created this scene where essentially he's putting us in the place of a government official who is being confronted by this very diverse looking group of Americans. Norman Rockwell is trying really hard to show us who America is here. I love that he includes himself along the side over here, and I love that he's standing next to hippies. It really shows us where his mind is. But you can see that he, as a person, was an empathetic person who was kind of opening his arms up to and really embracing all of America, even and especially those people that had been omitted from the covers of the Saturday Evening Post for so long. So one of his very last pictures was a cover painting for American Artist magazine. It was their July 4th cover for the centennial, 1976. And they asked Norman Rockwell to paint a picture. And you can see at this point in his career, his ability to paint detail like he had before has really declined. But he paints himself draping a happy birthday banner on the Liberty Bell, which is, I think, the perfect American icon for him, because he certainly loved America, but he certainly saw its flaws and embraced America nonetheless. Just a year or so later, he's awarded the Presidential Medal of Freedom from Gerald Ford. This is Rockwell sitting in his studio in Stockbridge looking at that award. He dies in 1978, and you can see by February 1979, it's like there had been no bad blood with the Saturday Evening Post. He was their poster boy again, and they're creating covers to honor him and his legacy. But I think when we think about his legacy in particular, we see artists today who are very consciously quoting his work and updating it so that you can see an America that is much more diverse than the America that that Norman Rockwell is credited with painting. And what's so wonderful is that I think he would love these updates, and I think that he would have painted them this way had he been able to back in the 1940s and 50s. Here's just another image. This is a mural in New Orleans that shows the same idea of racial integration, but in this case, it's the white kids moving into the Black neighborhood. So we've seen these two sort of huge icons of American creativity, these titans from the 20th century, and how they responded to these huge changes. We have Wright responding to the Depression and the need to create affordable middle-class housing, and he does that by sort of compressing the grand ideas from a place like Falling Water and putting it into a home that, in theory, a middle-class American could buy. And then we have Norman Rockwell, who's responding to how the country was changing, particularly in the 1960s. He goes to a new employer and begins to picture the America that he really loves, an America that that embraces diversity and different points of view. So I think that brings us to just about an hour, and I want to pause here and welcome any questions or comments anybody might have about Frank Lloyd Wright or Norman Rockwell, and I will do my best to answer them. And I'll start taking a look at the chat here as well. see here. Okay, we've got some specific questions about the Zimmerman House. Okay. And people asking about flaws with falling water and flaws with the Zimmerman House. And there certainly were flaws with both. Falling water, in particular, the dramatic sort of cantilevered terraces there, they all began to sag after some time. And so those terraces needed a great deal of work in order to remain sort of parallel to the ground this way. So it's undergone a great deal of restoration, and the Zimmerman House as well. I mentioned before that these Usonian houses, 50% of them were still occupied by their owners after 35 years. There's thinking out there in Frank Lloyd Wright circles that perhaps he didn't design these houses to outlive their owners. There's a lot of upkeep when it comes to them. And let me just see if I can get that chat back here just a moment. Oh, I seem to have lost the chat, but I think there were questions specifically about the Zimmerman House and the maintenance of the Zimmerman House and how it's been upkeep and how it's been kept up. And I give so much credit to the Courier Museum because they have done just an incredible amount of work to preserve this house and to make it look the way Frank Lloyd Wright intended. Having traveled all around the country to see other Frank Lloyd Wright designed homes, this is a spectacularly preserved example. Many of them are kind of falling into decay, not ruin per se, but they present challenges. So the roof was a challenge. The Zimmermans had replaced it with asphalt shingles, and the Courier replaced it with the tiles that had been originally specified. The floor had radiant heating in the floor, and that had failed after some time. And so the Courier actually removed all of the contents of the home, jackhammered the floor, and put in new radiant heating in the house. So there's been all sorts of renovations in order to keep the house as close to the way it was intended to be when it was designed by Frank Lloyd Wright. So I'm really sorry. For some reason, I can't access the chat anymore.
I can see the chat, and maybe I could mediate.
Okay, that'd be great, John.
And Philippi shared her observation that the families in moving day, the black family has a white cat, and the white family has a black dog. Mm-hmm. Asked, are the faces in his group paintings, in general, I believe, they the faces of real people, or are they created?
Generally speaking, they are of real people and specific individuals. I think really only the Ruby Bridges picture is one of probably only a few that I can think of where he took multiple models and sort of created one identity from those multiple models. But you can see from the photographs here that the children these look like really specific portraits of his models here. But yeah, there's a lot to take apart in this picture. I love the detail that it's a white pet for the black kids and a black pet for the white kids. I also really love the way he uses color in general in this picture, that you have that light yellow convertible back here with the chair in the foreground and the sweater. So your eyes sort of moving around in this triangle. One other detail that's just fantastic in this picture, if you have really good eyes, you can see that there's a nosy neighbor peeking out behind their curtains over here, very interested in what is about to unfold in the neighbor's yard. And aren't we all that nosy neighbor too? You know, what is about to happen here? So I mean, this is just sort of expertly conceived in so many ways.
Where is the nosy neighbor? Could you put your cursor?
Oh, sure, it's right over here.
Oh my goodness, yes, yeah. Thank you. Yeah. So, Taffy Johnson asks, how is the Zimmerman house heated?
So that is, it's a radiant floor heating, and so it's forced hot water underneath that concrete floor. You can imagine how lovely that would feel on a cold winter night with a warm concrete floor underneath your feet. I long for that. I think that would be amazing.
Those are all the chat questions I see, but I think we can ask questions the old-fashioned way for a few more minutes. If people want to unmute or raise their hands.
And certainly, if anybody has questions or comments after the fact, please feel free to reach out to me. There's like a contact form on my website too. So, so that's always a way as well. But I know there was a lot of content here, and these, both of these men had very long careers, very long lives. They were prolific. And so it was hard to encapsulate everything that they did into one short hour. But hopefully you got a sense in terms of how both of them sort of pivoted to create something that reflected America probably a little bit more accurately, but still kind of stayed within their wheelhouse and reflected their own creative vision. So I hope that came across tonight.
Well, I have a quick question. Do you know anything about if and when the Rockwell Museum in Massachusetts is going to be open?
Oh, I should have looked that up, John.
I guess any of us could look it up, but
that should be on my top, because I certainly want to go there too. I think I'm assuming that, like many museums, hopefully, this summer, but I'm not sure. They might be open now already. Yeah. But that's a good question, because I think a lot of times after you see a few of these images, it's like you long to go there. Absolutely.
Here's a new question on the chat from CC Survivors. Does the text in the center of Moving Day have any significance?
Let's see. Oh, right here. CC, thank you for pointing that out. I've never even looked that closely at that. And now I'm wondering, I haven't come across anything that really talks about it. But now I'm going to have to go and explore that. Thanks for pointing that out.
That's the weight of the truck, that's all.
Oh, that's all the weight of the truck? Okay. There's got to be something else to it now. But it's interesting that it's right there at the center of the picture. It seems like it would have more. Well, I mean, it's the weight of
17,500 pounds.
The weight of the event here too.
Well, may I suggest that we all unmute to show our appreciation for the wonderful presentation? Thank you so much, everybody, for coming. And I think you saw Jane O'Neill's IamCulturallyCurious.com.
Yeah.
And you all know WalkerLecture.org.
Thank you.
Thank you, everybody, for coming tonight. So great to see so many familiar faces. I really appreciate it.
Thanks, Jane.
Thank you, Jane. That was wonderful.
I miss you.
Thank
Great
you,
to see
Jane.
you.